Just like the Goldust interviews from the previous 2 episodes of Raw, Mick Foley gets a chance next to let people see behind the gimmick a little. Jim Ross interviews Foley, and in comparison to the Goldust promos, the Foley interviews were excellent. The big difference here is that Foley maintains his Mankind character throughout while still talking about his real life, and these interviews were so good that they helped push Mick Foley further up the cards while also eventually turning Mankind into a babyface. Mankind says the biggest misconception about him is that he's a bad person. There's plenty of reasons to dislike Mankind, but he doesn't want people to dislike him over things that aren't true. He's a guy who always stood up for the underdog. He goes on to say when he was 8 years old he got accidentally kicked in the lip by another kid, and all the kids looked at Foley as his Chicago Bears shirt turned red with blood. The other kids got scared. Foley was hurt, but he enjoyed the attention. He found something he could do better than anyone else: handle pain. Mankind says he found his calling in life with pro wrestling. He could bleed and get paid for it. Foley watched Bruno Sammartino, the Valiant Brothers, and Chief Jay Strongbow, and Mick would dream of one day becoming a professional wrestler. Mick then talks about having a tough time as a teenager. Other kids would throw worms at him, and instead of throwing them back, Mick ate a worm to show it didn't bother him. The story got exaggerated and Foley was now eating a plate of worms every day, and this destroyed his social life and his chances of finding a girlfriend. Foley wanted to be loved and he wanted to love, but he didn't get a date during his high school days because of these exaggerated stories, and this had a psychological effect on Mankind as he went into adulthood. There's more to come in the following weeks, including a look at Dude Love, a character Mick dreamed up that Jim Ross says didn't differ too much from Shawn Michaels, and we'll also learn about Cactus Jack and the death matches that he took part in Japan. Foley talks about travelling to Madison Square Garden in October of 1983. Inside the garden, he witnessed Jimmy Snuka diving off a steel cage right onto Don Morocco, and that moment changed his life. Foley hitchhiked to the garden, he got a good seat, he saw people cheer when Snuka jumped off the cage, and it was those cheers that made Foley realise what he wanted all along. He wanted people to cheer for him after an act of bravery. He wanted to see people react emotionally to his actions. Ross says Foley went home and he developed an alter ego, one with the athleticism of Snuka and the sex appeal Foley desperately wanted in high school. Foley says Shawn Michaels asked him if this Mankind and Cactus Jack stuff was what Foley really wanted to be all his life, and Mick says he told HBK he wanted to be just like him at one point. Not the champion, but a guy who gets female attention, a guy who's loved by his fans, the jewelry, the tattoos. And Foley made a movie featuring this alter ego, his first ever character. Not Cactus Jack, not Mankind, but Dude Love. Dude Love wanted to do something brave just like Jimmy Snuka, so Mick ascended up onto his friend's roof and he jumped off. Footage of this jump is then shown on Raw. Jim Ross says it was this footage of Dude Love that made its way to Dominic DeNucci and Foley got his break. He began his training and his path to pro wrestling glory would begin. Mick says he wasn't ready to be Dude Love, he certainly didn't want to be Cactus Jack, but the initial plan was to use the Cactus Jack character while Mick figured out the wrestling business and figured out how to work better. Then, and only then, would Mick put the tattoo on his chest and become Dude Love. But it didn't quite work out that way. Nature didn't cooperate with Mick, and Jack was supposed to only last 3 months, but he stayed around for 11 years. This is some truly outstanding stuff here, and it's still really interesting to watch today. Foley's delivery was excellent, and he really comes off as vulnerable, even though Mankind, as a character, was completely unhinged and ruthless. It's the way he talks, the way he looks down at the floor, the way he tells the story. I'm not sure anyone could have pulled this off as well as Mick, and he deserves so much credit for these interviews. Next week we're going to learn about Cactus Jack in Japan. They said this stuff would get covered this week, but that's not the case. We're talking about Cactus Jack this week during Foley's interview, and Mick says what made Cactus Jack different was the fact that he wanted it a little bit more. He'd go the extra mile to make it in the business, including sleeping in cars and giving up relationships. In the land of bodybuilders, Cactus Jack said he'd do it his way. He wouldn't dye his hair, he wouldn't conform to the normal look of a wrestler. Cactus Jack wanted to be himself. Jim Ross talks about independent promoters telling Mick to tone down the violence in the United States, and so Foley left for Japan. Mick heard about the Japanese death matches and he said he didn't care about the danger, this was his destiny. He saw the barbed wire and he thought he was finally home. Beds of nails, C4, thumbtacks, the pain didn't matter to Cactus Jack because Jack gained respect. He was finally loved, he had dignity, but now in the World Wrestling Federation, Mick isn't sure if he has that dignity anymore. Mick shows his battle scars while reciting St. Crispin's Day speech from Shakespeare's Henry V, and Mick then says he looks in the mirror and he sees a life fulfilled through his scars, being able to name the countries where he got his wounds. Jack then talks about a woman who sat beside him on an airplane while he was injured. The lady got one look at Foley and she decided to pay money to move to another seat. Mick says he'll never forget the look on her face. He then realised that not only was he the deathmatch champion, but he also had the ability to make people sick. I can't say enough good things about these interviews, but unfortunately it all ends next week when Mick Foley talks about the Mankind character and his time in the World Wrestling Federation so far. Foley then comes out for his King of the Ring quarter-final match against Savio Vega, and he gets a babyface reaction. Now, it wasn't as prevalent or as loud as what WWE documentaries would like you to believe it was. Vince and Jim Ross also work overtime to get Foley over as a babyface on commentary for the viewers at home, but it was still definitely there. The WWF were switching the deranged Mankind into a good guy. They also zoom in on this absolute mooncat here with his holographic eyeball glasses. Bet he thought he was the shit. No nerve pinches from Savio Vega, but he pulled off this awesome crossbody from the top rope to the outside. Lawler was talking shit about Mankind on commentary, and so Mankind decided to pull the King away from the announce table. The ref checks on the King while Foley applies the mandible claw on Vega, and Crush ends up accidentally hitting his Nation teammate with a hard punch to end the match. Mick wins via pinfall. Crush and Savio fight after the bell and Farouk decides he's had enough. He doesn't come down to break up the fight. Officials have to break up the fighting instead just before Raw moves on to its final main event segment. The story here though was Mick Foley, and Foley now had to be a favourite to win the King of the Ring. The final part of the Mankind interview airs next on Raw while Dean Malenko defends the US title against Double J. Before showing the interview, Jim Ross says he wishes he never took this interview assignment and he never felt more helpless than what he did at the end of this conversation with Foley. We go to the pre-tape and Mankind says Cactus Jack never came to the WWF because he wasn't welcomed in. He says when you look at Mankind now and you see the mandible claw, Foley imagines that it's Vince McMahon on the receiving end and he's screaming at Vince, "Why didn't you take me when I was good? And why didn't you take me when I was young?" Mankind then talks about Shawn Michaels. He says both he and Michaels had the same dream, and Foley can't understand why Shawn looks as good as he does, yet Mankind looks terrible. So this makes Mankind wish Shawn Michaels a lifetime of misery, and Mankind isn't ashamed about wishing trauma and tragedy on others. Mankind wants others to suffer the same way he suffered. Jim wonders if Mick has a multiple personality disorder, and Mick says he doesn't believe in doctors, and if there was something wrong with his mind, then Mick would be the first one to know. Jim then says that maybe Mick Foley should take responsibility for all the things that's happened to him, and maybe Foley should realise that he brought a lot of this pain to himself. And Mick says Jim should end this facade of journalistic integrity. Mick says Jim's told people on commentary that Mankind enjoys pain, and because Jim reaches a lot of people, then people are going to believe what Ross says. Foley then begins punching himself in the face while saying he feels pain like everyone else. It hurts, and Mankind starts to wonder when he'll start enjoying this pain like Ross says he does. Maybe it's when he can't get up to play with his son, or maybe it's when he has to get injections in his spine so he can wrestle one more match. Ross looks uncomfortable as Mick begins losing it. Foley says Ross has misled people into thinking Mankind is having the time of his life when Foley is actually in constant pain. Foley then applies the mandible claw, we hear the camera crew screaming, and Mick does show remorse afterwards when he asks someone to help Jim, but that's it guys. That's the end of the excellent Mick Foley interviews. Jim Ross says afterwards that he did ask tough questions and he apologises for pushing the wrong buttons. but he still believes a wrestler shouldn't put their hands on an announcer.